I've spent the last year looking at all of the top resin printers on the market. There are some good ones and, unfortunately, some bad ones. But right now, at the start of the new year, I want to look to the future. I really want to just go on a journey of imagination. We have all these great printers, but what will the future bring? What should the future bring? And I'd love to hear your thoughts too. What do you want? Am I right? Am I wrong? Please drop your thoughts down in the comments section as I plan to use them in future videos. At the very least, I hope this will serve as a wake-up call for the brands out there making these printers. It should also make it easy for someone new to have a point of reference, a list of boxes they should tick if they want to create the world's next leading consumer resin printer. So let's get on with making things easy for the printer brands by telling them what we want. Hi, I'm Ross, and this is FoHammer Videos. So for the format of this video, I want to go through all the different features and functions of a printer and talk about who's given us the best as a springboard for what we want going forward. And I was going to end with the style of the printer. Once going through all of the different features, we'd finish on the housing to put this all in. But in reflection, if I'm watching this, I'd kind of want to be able to picture it in my mind up front. So when choosing the style of the best 3D printer out there, I'd like to take some massive design cues from the Hagear's Ultracraft Reflex. I mean, this is an easy pick, surely. The machine is gorgeous, but beyond that, there are a ton of functional elements in its form factor too. I mean, I don't know anybody who likes lift-off lids, except maybe the few people who use their printers in a print farm and never have the lids on anyway, because they just keep the whole place at room temperature. There have been a few other printers with lift-up lids, but the two which come to mind most recently are the Frozen Mega 8KS and the Nova 3D Whale 3. Whilst the Frozen model has a nice strong hinge mechanism that keeps the lid in place as you lift it or lower it, both printers suffer from the raised lid protruding out the back, meaning you need your printer a good distance away from the wall. The GK2 has a lift-up lid, but the hinges are a bit weak and the rear chassis curves a good 2/3 around the sides as it covers around the build area. The Reflex's lid is both angled and hinged in such a way that it clears plenty of space for accessing the printer's internals, whilst only taking up additional height in your workspace rather than empty depth too. But yeah, in taking up height, they would lose a lot of customers in those aforementioned print farms who just don't have that height spare. So however it's done, design the lid mechanism in such a way that with only a few screws or such, you could swap this mechanism over to a lid which can be removed entirely by just pulling it towards you and away from the machine. But it's not just the functional feature of that design either. The visual style of the machine and the materials all feel robust and solid. Even the colourway makes this come across as a more professional tool than the cheapo plasticiness of more affordable models like most Elegoo and Anycubic machines. I do wish, however, the lid was more translucent because it's hard to see inside this one, and I also wish it was a brighter orange. What? It matches my branding. Of course I want a metallic grey and orange printer. When we look inside the machine, the next thing I want to talk about is the build plate. When it comes to this component, adherence is key, and I suspect many people would want me to say they should come with a magnetic build plate. Now, I do see the benefit in this were it the manufacturers who installed them in such a way that would ensure that they won't come unstuck. But I see so many issues with people self-installing third-party ones that they make me nervous to the point that I'm not going to try them. But as I said, I do see the benefit that you can easily pop these off and the flex will allow you to break models' base layers away much easier. Now personally, I don't care if this build surface is textured or even laser etched like the Saturn printers or smooth like on the GK2. Once you've got your base layers dialed in properly, you should have no adherence issues during print and no over adherence after a print. Though, gotta consider everyone, and if a build plate isn't smooth, you'll end up with some texture, and that could put off some buyers who do resin print direct from the plate rather than support models. So I guess, yeah, if done right, I would like to see removable flexible surfaces properly integrated into printers, perhaps in a variety of styles and textures like on FDM printers. It could be cool. If they add this, I just hope it includes some kind of notch for easy one-handed alignment. The other thing I want to talk about here is the shape of the build plate, because so far only Uniformation made a build plate that combats this, and that's a build plate that keeps the top out of the vat. And yeah, the GK2 plate may look heavy and clunky, but it's actually quite light because, well, it's plastic. But I'm sick of having to wait every time a print is complete for the resin to run off the plate or to need to scrape it off myself before I can move the plate to my workbench for cleaning. So if we aren't getting removable flexible print surfaces, let's at least keep the top of the build plate out of the resin, please. Now when it comes to the connection to the Z-arm, well, it's easy this one. Enough with the bolts, people, and if you're gonna do bolts, then do the asymmetrical lever style used on the Nova 3D Whale SE or the Elegoo Jupiter SE, because they are much easier to loosen and tighten. But ideally, a nice latch as seen on the GK2 or the Ultracraft Reflex would be ideal, because that's really simple to put the build plate in and pull the latch down to lock it in place one-handed, because your other hand is probably holding models or a tool or is just covered in resin. For the Z-rail, I'd say we'd like 2 rails, but I think that's obvious. No matter how big or small the print bed is, stability across the width of the arm is key. And when it comes to the screw for the mechanism, the ball screws are much smoother than lead screws, so yeah, I'd really like to see more of those in printers going forward, especially if you want to be classed as a quality one. As for the rotation of this screw, well, manufacturers I think should be aware that we really need a motor capable of a 20 micron increment of the plate lift height. We already have screens with sub 20 micron pixels, let's make sure we can match that in the Z height too. Or, at the very least, hey brands, why don't you start publishing the minimum step distance with your printers? If it's 6 microns, cool, but just tell us, clearly. At least then we can reduce the layer height to 18 microns instead of rounding up to 20 and having the printer compensate for us every few layers. Please, just allow us to be accurate. And when it comes to speed, well, the minimum movement speed I've ever needed on PFA film is 60mm a minute, or also known as 1mm a second. So it needs to be able to go at least this slow. If it goes too fast, it won't work with some of the higher quality resins. And by quality, I mean print quality. And for those out there who want fast printers, well, the brands are now competing with the likes of the Frozen Mega 8KS, which is apparently capable of 1200mm a minute or 20mm a second. And yeah, that's far beyond what the materials and pull forces are capable of, but since it's been done, let's just call this the benchmark set and let the materials catch up. Next, onto the vat. And the first bit is simple, make it metal so you don't look cheap. But if you are going to make it plastic, at least make it translucent so that the few times when we're using translucent resin, we might be able to see the layers before they start to rise out of the vat. That'd be handy. And you should also everyone should put a protruding sprout on one corner, not just a different shaped corner, but an actual spout that sticks out of the vat, again, like on the Ultracraft Reflex. So at least then, when you're pouring resin out of it, it doesn't run down and under the vat and risk going onto the FEP or just drip everywhere. And the other thing this must have is an integrated heater within the vat itself. This has been done on the Apex Maker X1. It's the most efficient way to heat resin, and it should be adopted by every brand and be in every printer. Perhaps, I don't know, give us the option to get a vat without it to save costs, but there should definitely be an option for a heated vat on every single printer made going forwards. And I know people talk about chamber heaters, but they warm the resin in the vat last, after heating the air in the chamber and the already cured model. They're certainly useful as an addition to a vat heater or a heater below the resin chamber, but alone they're not the best approach. As for release film, well, this might not surprise anyone. PFA all the way for quality. But ACF needs to be available as an option for those happy to sacrifice a bit of quality for an improved print speed. And finally, when attaching the vat to the printer, no more bolts please. Once again, I'll cite the Ultracraft Reflex here. Give us some nice latches, or like the GK2, have a way to lock it in place, and whilst you're at it, put some comfortable handles on the vat itself too please. And finally, something that I'm just making up out of nowhere, I'd really like someone to come up with a better way of attaching the release film to the vat itself, because the current process it takes forever to swap the film on any printer. That's our main technical parts covered. I want to quickly talk about an important function, leveling. First off, instead of spending the whole video imagining what we want, let's talk about what we don't want. And what we don't want is the stupid Elegoo ball mount on any printer. And to the 7 of you who have never had problems with yours, feel free to voice your opinion in the comments below, I know you will. And I like when you do it because your interactions increase the reach of this video, so thanks for your help while you're having a go at me. Look, I know I'm having a crack, but please understand that I've seen more comments in agreement with this than the few of you who don't need to re-level every 3 or 4 prints. And the typical 4-point screw mechanism used on every other printer out there is certainly the better option when done right, but honestly, neither of these are the best, and that's what this video is about, right? The best of everything. The best mechanism I've seen so far for leveling the plate is used on printers like the Apex Maker X1, Frozen's Mega 8K printers, and the GK2, just to name a few of them. These use a set of inner grub screws that set the level of the bed to each corner, and then 4 outer screws which go in the opposite direction to lock them in place. It's easy to level these when you understand it, but because I'm yet to see one like this unlevel itself, in my opinion they should be pre-leveled from the factory anyway. And whilst we're on the inside of this imaginary printer, let's talk about some other things we want to get inside there, shall we? One is a carbon filter, like what Elegoo has been giving us, but a better one. These shouldn't be running for the whole print because that just wears them out faster, but it's definitely better to have one circulating the air inside the chamber and therefore keeping it running through the filter over and over, rather than what Elegoo's done with the Mars Mate and pump it all out into your room. And it'd be nice to see these with some kind of air quality sensor inside the chamber too, so then at least you know when it's safer to open the lid. This is probably super expensive, but again guys, we're wishing for stuff here. And despite this being in there, I'd still also like to see an optional vent cover like we have on pretty much any of Elegoo's large printer lids and also on the Mega 8KS from Frozen. With this, at least we'd have the option to pump vapors outside. And then there's the resin pump. I've said many times that, well, I'm personally not a fan of these because they're just too messy. If you're going to do one, do it, but it needs some way of being compatible with all the bottle types, or give us some empty containers like Anycubic did with the Wash and Cure Max. And the flip your bottle upside down options never seem to do so well. The one on the Nova 3D printers just worries me, and the one on the Ultracraft Reflex is, well, it's over-engineered. And in both cases, when swapping the bottle out, they drip everywhere. So if you are going to offer this, then I like Frozen's approach. Make it an optional extra for those people who don't mind paying more to have it and keep the printer costs down a bit. And speaking of Frozen, one thing they added on the Mighty 8K that completely failed was the camera. But this is not a bad idea for a feature. If you're going to do this, you should do this. Take a leaf out of Bamboo's book and put a couple of very good bright lights in your chamber so we can actually see the model printing when checking on it overnight and not just a silhouette because the only light in the room comes from outside of the printer case. And since most cameras are widescreen, it would make sense to orient it sideways, however, so we can see more height than width in the image. Make sure it's a decent 1080p camera, but give us the option to upgrade to 4K if you can. And make sure the printer automatically creates time lapses by taking a photo when the bed lifts for each layer. You might be thinking that's an arbitrary feature, but actually if you included that function, everyone online would share videos of your printer on social media saying, look at this that I printed on that. Yes, it's an expensive component guys, but it's also free marketing afterwards. So moving out of the printer and back to the externals, I'd like to talk about ports. The power socket hole needs to be on the back of the printer, along with any type of network interface such as Ethernet or anything else special that you want to put on there that's used by just a handful of people. USB ports should be on the front. If you're going to add Wi-Fi, and you should add Wi-Fi, because in this day and age even some toasters, kettles and microwaves have Wi-Fi. But if you're going to add Wi-Fi, then please make sure the aerial for it is inside the chassis and not sticking out the side somewhere. And the remaining key feature is, well, it's the interface with the printer. This needs to be a capacitive touchscreen, and my favourite interfaces so far are between the Saturn III Ultra and the Apex Maker X1. The former has a lot of controls and it's very intuitive, everything is well translated and all the options are in a sensible place. But the much larger approach taken by Apex Maker is really impressive, it's just a shame that it's let down by a few unintuitive icons and an incomplete translation. As a note to all printer makers, this is one of the most important features of your machine. It's how your user commands the printer to do things. Make it sexy, make it fast, and make all of the most common features be on the front and most obvious screen. Secondary functions on the next, and any ancillary functions should be on a third or even fourth level. That's it. Also, when the printer's printing, show us meaningful info, show us a render of what the currently exposed layer looks like, show us some info about the temperature and other settings that are happening inside the machine at the time that are important that you might want to know when a print is printing. But more than anything, please show us a clear progress bar with a countdown timer telling us how long in time until the print is done. And then external to this but also in controls, please stop it with all the proprietary weird apps to connect to Wi-Fi and all that lark too. We all know how smartphones work, the UI designers surely have one, so make all of the setup controls as simple as a phone app. And if you're gonna make a phone app too, so we can, remotely monitor the prints or control it from our phones, please make sure it's nothing like Creality Cloud's FOMO style hard sell of absolute crap and its unintuitive storefront. Be like Anchormate, be like Bamboo Handy. Then build your storefront from a solid and sensible foundation once everything else works in a good way. I mean, it doesn't sound like this is too hard, yet so many brands get it very wrong.
Disappointed!
And it will be the first thing that us reviewers slate when lazy design makes it harder than it needs to be to use a printer. And finally, some functional features. All printers should come with a built-in series of exposure tests built into the onboard control system or UI, and it should walk you through things like leveling and further testing on the UI. It should have you print a load of squares at different base exposure times in one print so you can see which ones stuck and which ones are too stuck. From this, you can then determine what your best base exposure time is. And all printers should do what AnyCubic offers and let you print a resin exposure rangefinder at different exposure times on one plate, and then the UI should explain to you how to determine which one the best is. And it should then let you walk through a series of further tests to determine things like best lift speed. Again, this should all be on the UI and explain how to work out what fails look like. And finally, it should let you then use these dialed in settings to test different amounts of anti-aliasing to remove all traces of voxel and layer lines with minimal impact on detail. Would this take some time for a person to do? Yes. But to dial in your printer perfectly anyway, you need to do this anyway. And everyone in the world needs to learn how to do it with a myriad of different tests and opinions out there, hoping that they've guessed and have the best results, yet they have no validation. This is why the printer should do this, and that's how Bamboo won the FDM race, by having things like calibration already set for the user, or it walks them through it and holds their hand from the slicer. And I also want to talk about a feature that most of you have probably never heard of. These home printers need a way for increasing the exposure time, or ideally intensity, of just the supports. Layer times are so fast now anyway that it's the lift and retract speed slowing down resin printing. So we have plenty of time to even double up our exposure times and still get fast prints. And since we don't have direct control, why can't a brand already figure out some way of when the bed lowers, it cures the objects layer, and then without moving dynamically increases the light intensity and cures the supports separately before lifting? And why would you do this? Well, this would actually harden the supports more and make them more brittle, which means as you pull them away from the model, the supports themselves are the weaker part of the object and are the more likely failure point. This is what industrial printers do in order to make parts that are needle thin break away from supports without any damage, and doing this would be a complete resin game changer. And another thing that should be baked into slicers is some kind of test similar to the cones of calibration, where different amounts of material are supported by different thicknesses of material. By printing something like this and telling the slicer which ones failed, it'd go a long way to informing the slicer which supports or even just parts of the model would fail before you even start a print, because it would have been able to determine the maximum pull forces on different diameters of material and how much material each of them is expected to hold. Once we had something like this, auto supports would become an absolute breeze. But that requires someone to actually spend time in developing one of these slicers alongside the printer hardware. And thus far, every brand has relied on Chitubox, Lychee or Tango and done little more than rebrand one of those apps to their own. Right then, as always, we leave the best till last, the screen. And as I read through this and realise how much of my script I've got to go, probably should have made this a separate video, so I'm going to try and give you the cliff notes and then I'll do that another time. Now the first thing I want to say is, considering the screen is a replaceable part, everybody should do what Uniformation has done and make it so that it's easy to access that component. With pretty much every printer ever, it's half a teardown to get access to the screen in order to replace it. With the GK2, you pop out 4 screws, flip up a latch for a ribbon cable, and put the new screen in. Now, coming back to imagining the final parts of the printer, I honestly don't care what the screen size is. The screen size should cater for the needs of the user, and the size of the screen and the cost of the printer should increase or decrease accordingly based on how big or how small it is. And as I talk about this, I've got no idea how these things are made. I've no idea how any of this is made, nor do I even care. I'm just saying what we should have. Much cleverer people than me need to work out how to actually do it. But whatever the screen size is, it's the pixel size that matters, and please stop chasing 8K, 12K, 24K, 62K, whatever. Let's go through some math, and by that I mean insane math that I got off the internet and pulled a couple of bits, chucked it all into Excel, got a result, and it kinda makes sense. As we've learned from Retina displays, the human eye cannot see a difference between pixels when they're around 326 pixels per inch and you're holding it at about a foot away from your face. Now this is where I once again talk crazy math in a video, but go with me and tell me if my theory is wrong in the comments. So here we go. First of all, yes, we'd all love this screen to be DLP, but nobody's driving DLP technology forward as much as LCD. We are years away from seeing these resolutions on DLP, if not decades or even never. But with technologies like Cobb light sources for even distribution of UV light across the display and Fresnel lenses, LCD is actually close to matching the sharpness of DLP now anyway. But for the math, go with me. Let's assume we have a pixel density of 326 ppi like on the Retina display, and let's take the Saturn III as our subject to use a pretty standard size of the x-axis print volume, which is 218.88mm. In inches, this would be around 8.62 inches. Multiplying the width in inches by 326 pixels per inch tells us that this imaginary screen would have 2810 pixels on the x-axis. So if we divide the 218.88mm of that axis by the number of pixels in it, that tells us that we would have a pixel width of 78 microns. And let's just assume that this display has square pixels just to avoid any confusion. And I didn't need the printer and the math. I could have worked this out from the same just using 1mm, but then I'd have nothing to show on screen, and this is a printer's video. So if the logic of Retina displays is correct and that the human eye can't determine the difference between pixels at 326 pixels per inch or on pixels that are 78 microns in size when they're 12 inches away from your eye, how then are we able to see voxel lines on prints with screens where the pixels are as low as 50 microns? Well, here's my theory. With Retina displays, it's a flat 2D plane, but your eyes have a special power. When you're lucky enough to have 2 of them, you can also register depth, an additional dimension that is not present on 2D screens. These 3-dimensional objects are also affected by light bouncing off the edges differently, which accents the forms. And due to the cinematic lighting I tend to use in my videos, I always light subjects from the side, which makes things stand out more. Light things from the front, and those voxel lines start to disappear and blur. So okay, let's account for that special depth power by doubling the PPI to 652 and using the same math in Excel. The pixel size goes down to 39 microns, and this is where things start to become a little less obvious. This is the same in Z resolution too, for those of you still printing at 50 micron layer heights. Also, as an additional FYI, most of the industrial DLP printers used in the production of things like miniatures operate at around 38 microns in pixel size anyway, and that's because the industry manufacturers know that this is as much as you probably need. And when you're around this size, you just need to add the smallest amount of anti-aliasing, and you don't need to push the technology further to improve the detail beyond reasonable. Blurring the surface on the edge of each layer projection will soften all of that out without any distinguishable loss of detail to the overall piece. And I know there's a few of you out there who are still thinking, but I've watched your videos, Fohammer, and I can still see voxel lines on your prints with much smaller pixel sizes. But again, let me stress the Retina example on phones is when the phone is 12 inches from your eyes. That's a lot different to me shooting images of it on my macro lens and you watching it on your big screen. The model I always show of me wearing power armor built with parts from Atlan Forge is about as tall as my thumbnail, or 15mm. How many 15mm can you fit in the area of the screen that you're looking at this model on? And again, consider that the lighting also accents all of the sharp edges. And also, when any of us are out there shooting miniatures to share photos with our friends, how big are they on your screen compared to the model itself? If it's 2 times bigger, you'd need a printer with 19 micron pixels to hide those lines, and we have that in a way because these new 12K screens have 19 micron pixels on the x-axis. But as I look back at my Mars 4 reviews, I can't see any voxel lines when I zoom in. With its 18 micron square pixels, only the layer lines are visible, and they're 30 microns. And if you wanted 4 times magnification, which isn't realistic for miniatures when you're seeing them on a computer screen, you'd actually need 10 micron pixels for them to disappear completely. So as I've said now for over a year, just enable anti-aliasing and be happy with what your printer does. I think no matter what printer screen size we go for, yeah, we should aim for all printers to have sub 20 micron pixels, and we should print at 20 micron layer heights for the most detailed prints, which will allow for 2 times magnification without these lines being significantly visible. But even then, you may as well enable anti-aliasing to smooth everything out perfectly anyway, and to avoid any light cast highlighting them. But the thing I want to see the most is brands need to stop chasing this resolution metric because, well, I hope I've kind of theoretically proven here it's pointless and we're all sick of it. And besides, no matter how good the screens are getting, most resins can't render that level of detail anyway. I hope my insane math and specious logic makes sense, and I hope you enjoyed coming on this journey with me. Hopefully now we will get some brands listening and heading towards this. More than anything, I'd like to see all the companies release finished printers. You'll see on my channel I haven't reviewed the Athena yet, and that's because they aren't releasing it until it's done. And for that alone, I have very high hopes for that printer. And also printer brands, if you're going to give us a USB drive and expect that to be a key part of the machine, please give us a decent quality one or just don't bother. I want to say thanks for watching and thanks to our members who help us make these videos. Please consider joining to get some benefits. There is a link below this video. Unless you're on iPhone, the link is in the description. Please don't forget to like, hit subscribe, the notification bell, but especially leave a comment. What do you think? What do you want in a future printer? Until next time, life finds a way. Fohammer out.